Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something that's absolutely crucial to philosophy, and that's agency.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Wow.
And, at first glance, it might seem pretty straightforward, right? The ability to act, to make things happen.
Right.
But as any philosophy enthusiast knows, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And we are going deep today.
Oh, yeah.
For this deep dive, we'll be turning to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on agency for some serious philosophical exploration. So get ready, because we're going to dissect how contemporary thought grapples with this concept and uncover all the nuances, the debates, and the implications. This one is for those who are already familiar with the philosophical landscape of agency. We're not going to hold back.
Right.
We're going to examine the major conceptions of agency, the theoretical frameworks that underpin our understanding, the mind-boggling metaphysical questions, and, of course, the ever-present empirical challenges that keep us on our toes.
Yeah, it's a deep dive into the deep dive, really,
Exactly. A deep dive into the deep dive. All right, so let's kick things off by going straight to the heart of the matter. In the world of philosophy, we often talk about the standard conception and the standard theory of agency. Yeah. And these really build upon some foundational work by folks like Anscombe and Davidson, and they really put this idea of intentional action front and center. So can you break down the core tenets of this view for us? What's at the heart of this standard conception?
Well, the standard conception really hinges on two main ideas. First, it claims that intentional action is more fundamental than just action itself.
Okay.
Right. So think about a simple example. You're flipping the light switch. You might do it intentionally to brighten up the room, but then you also end up unintentionally alerting, a burglar outside. So the entry highlights two ways to look at this. Either it's one single event with different descriptions, one intentional, one not, or you can think of that unintentional outcome as kind of being generated by the initial intentional act.
So almost like a ripple effect.
Yeah. Exactly, or a ripple effect. Regardless of which interpretation you favor, the point is that intentional action is kind of the key player here.
Okay, got it. So intentional action is the foundation. It's what drives everything. What's that second core claim that sort of underpins this standard conception?
All right, so the second key point here is the tight link between intentional action and the reason behind it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, early thinkers, going all the way back to Aristotle, saw these two as almost inseparable. To act intentionally was basically the same as acting for a reason. And this was often pictured as this structured idea, a practical syllogism. You got your goal, you got your belief about how to achieve it, and bam, that leads to the action.
A nice little equation.
Yeah, nice little equation. But as the encyclopedia details, things have become more nuanced since then. We got folks like Bratman coming along and arguing, hey, intentions aren't just reducible to desires and beliefs. They have their own unique role in our agency. So to really grasp this tradition's approach to agency, remember that it all begins with this idea that intentional action, that's where the action is, so to speak.
Okay. I love it. It all starts with intention. That makes sense. Now, how does the standard theory sort of build upon this foundation?
So the standard theory, it goes a step further and offers a causal explanation for this whole shebang.
Okay.
It says, look, when you perform an intentional action and you're doing it for a reason, it's fundamentally caused by the right kind of mental states, desires, beliefs, intentions working in just the right way. And this way of explaining it is often labeled as the causal theory of action. More specifically, it's event causal, meaning it emphasizes those causal connections between events in your mind and events in the physical world.
Cause and effect. Got it.
Cause and effect, yeah. So if we map this onto the concept of agency itself, who or what gets to be called an agent, how do we actually exercise agency in this framework? Well, from this perspective, the power to be an agent, it's basically the power to act intentionally. When you're exercising agency, you're performing intentional actions, along with any unintentional stuff that spills out from those. And the standard theory explains this by saying, hey, it's all about the right organization, the right connections, the right structure within your mental world. That's what gives those mental states the power to make things happen.
Makes sense. But there's this other almost instinctive feeling we have when we talk about agency, right? This initiation by the agent thing.
Yeah.
How does the standard theory explain that?
So this is where things get interesting, and there's a bit of back and forth. The standard theory explains initiation by pointing back to those mental states. Your intentions, they kickstart the whole process. But some folks say wait a minute, this doesn't quite capture the feeling that we are the ones starting things. It's not just about mental states firing. It's about us.
It's deeper than that.
It's deeper than that. They're like, maybe agency involves actions that are spontaneous, that maybe even pop up before we have a super clear reason or intention. Thinkers like Janae and O'Connor, they've really dug into this. And some even suggest this wild idea of agent causation, that the agent itself, not just its mental states, can directly cause things to happen, or even, uncaused acts of will, free will in its purest form.
That's getting into some serious metaphysical territory.
Yeah, it really is. Building on that idea of intentional action being at the center, we also have to consider this notion of initiation.
Yeah.
It's that feeling that we are the ones starting the action.
Right. And that feeling, that sense of control, I feel like that really gets to the heart of what we think of as distinctively human agency.
Absolutely.
Are there certain aspects of agency that seem to be unique to us as humans? And how well does that standard theory actually capture these more, I guess, complex or sophisticated forms of agency?
This is where things get even more intricate. And we start seeing some really interesting refinements and critiques of the standard theory popping up. Frankfurt's hierarchical view of agency is super important here.
Okay.
He basically said, what makes us persons, what sets us apart, is our ability to have second-order desires. That means desires about our desires. So you could want something that's a first-order desire, but then you can also want to have that desire, to let it guide you. That's a second-order desire. And when you identify with a first-order desire, you're basically saying, yeah, I want this desire to be the one that moves me to action. And that, according to Frankfurt, is a higher level of agency. And Taylor took this even further, linking it to the whole human versus non-human agent distinction.
So it's about being aware of your desires and choosing which ones to act on.
Exactly. It's like you're stepping back and taking stock of your motivations. The big question then becomes, is this just a fancy application of the standard theory? Or does it hint at something fundamentally different about human agency?
Right. Is there something special going on there?
Yeah. Now, what are some of those big critiques that have been thrown at the standard theory, especially when it comes to explaining this human side of agency?
Yeah, what are the criticisms?
Well, Velleman, he raised a really interesting point. He said, hang on, the standard theory might miss a crucial part, the agent's actual participation in the action. He pointed out that we can sometimes disown the very mental states that are supposed to be driving our actions.
Like we didn't really mean it.
Exactly, like a disconnect. And this suggests those mental states might not be the whole story because it seems like we can sometimes detach ourselves from them. So his solution was to find a mental state that we can't disown, something that's practically the agent itself. He proposed the desire to act in accordance with reasons.
So it's about acting for good reason.
That's the idea. It's like this core desire that reflects our rational nature. So Frankfurt is highlighting this reflective capacity as a defining feature of human agency. Now, let's dive into some of the critiques that have been leveled against the standard theory and how they grapple with this particularly human element.
Okay.
All right. Now, Bratman, who's done a ton of work on planning agency, he talks about full-blown agency being grounded in what he calls self-governing policies. These policies, he argues, are crucial in establishing our identity over time. They're like our guiding principles that help us navigate life and make choices in a consistent way. They give us the ability to take a stance on our own motivations and shape our actions in a coherent manner.
That makes sense. So has the standard theory just been sitting there unchallenged while all these critiques are flying around?
Oh, no, not at all. Mealy came in with a strong defense, saying that maybe trying to find one single mental state that is the agent is a bit of a wild goose chase. He says the main goal of the standard theory is to explain intentional action, not necessarily to cover every single aspect of human agency. He believes the agent does play a role in all this, even if sometimes it's a minimal role, or critics call it deficient. He basically argues that expanding the standard theory to handle those super complex parts of human agency like self-control and autonomy, that's a whole other project and a really important one at that.
So there's more work to be done there.
Oh yeah, definitely. Now shifting gears a bit, let's talk about agency without mental representations. This becomes really relevant when we think about non-human agents, even simple organisms.
Yeah, how do they fit into this?
Exactly. The standard theory, as we've seen, leans heavily on those desires, beliefs, and intentions. And usually we think of those as representational mental states. They have content, they stand for something else. But when you look at animals or even single-celled organisms, it's hard to imagine they've got these complex internal representations going on. And this throws some major curveballs at the standard view. Can you have agency without representations? Can even human agency be explained without them? And some even say all agency can be explained this way.
So it's like questioning the very building blocks of how we've been thinking about agency.
Exactly, challenging the core assumptions.
So how have those sticking with the standard theory addressed this idea of agency in beings that probably don't have these fancy mental representations?
One common move is to say, hold on, the standard theory specifically deals with intentional agency. There might be more basic kinds of agency that don't need mental representations.
Okay.
And the encyclopedia talks about this concept of minimal agency. Brandy and folks came up with this. Imagine a unified entity. It's got goal-directed behavior. It adapts to its environment. It maintains itself. Its basic goal is just to be. That's minimal agency. And it doesn't necessarily need a mental representation of a goal to do it.
Right. So they're operating on a more fundamental level.
Exactly. So we've been talking about agency in terms of beliefs and desires and all that. But what about those creatures that probably don't have those complex inner representations?
Right.
How does agency even work for them, and what challenges does that pose to the standard view?
Yeah, it's almost like a whole different category of agency.
Yeah, right. Now, how about this argument that even human agency, at least some of it, doesn't need mental representations to be explained? Yeah. This connects with what are called embodied and enactive approaches to cognition.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. They emphasize our direct engagement with the world, our skills, our responsiveness, our ability to interact effectively without necessarily thinking everything through consciously.
Yeah.
Think about riding a bike or having a spontaneous conversation.
I see.
That flow state.
Yeah.
Proponents of this view, they say explaining these actions using mental representations is often making things more complicated than they need to be.
Okay.
Simpler explanations focusing on our body and our responsiveness to the environment, they argue, do the job better.
So basically, we don't need all those mental gymnastics to explain a lot of what we do.
Right. They point out that defining mental representations is tricky, and we can explain skilled action without them. But the standard theory folks, they've got some counter-arguments. They say, hey, our theory doesn't need conscious deliberation about every mental state.
Okay.
It works fine with automatic processes like motor schemata doing their thing in the background.
Yeah.
And importantly, they say most skilled actions aren't just random. They're part of bigger, longer-term goals and intentions, which do seem to need some kind of representation.
So there's a hierarchy of agency at play there.
Exactly. Now, there's an even more radical claim that all agency, even the super complex human stuff with planning and thinking ahead, can be explained without mental representations.
Whoa, that's a big claim.
Yeah. And this was super controversial. Those radical embodied and enactive folks, they try to stretch the skilled action argument to cover everything.
Okay.
But it runs into trouble. How do you explain thinking about the future, abstract ideas, long-term plans, without representing them somehow in your mind?
Yeah, that's hard to imagine.
Right. Bratman's idea of representation-hungry planning agency really highlights this problem. It's tough to imagine committing to plans and sticking to them over time without mental representations.
It does seem like mental representations are needed for those higher level processes.
Right. So the agency landscape is definitely rich and diverse. Now, the encyclopedia moves on to talk about other kinds of agency beyond just intentional action.
Okay, so what are some of those alternative forms that they propose? What else is out there?
Right. So while the standard theory of intentional agency is, the main attraction, there are lots of other types of agency that philosophers have come up with to capture different aspects of our lives and interactions. We've got mental agency, epistemic agency, shared agency, collective agency, relational agency, and even, this super relevant concept of artificial agency.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. Let's dive into mental agency for a bit.
Okay.
It seems pretty obvious that our mental lives involve some kind of activity on our part, right? Paying attention, making judgments, reason, those all feel like things we do.
Right.
But how does the standard theory usually handle these kinds of mental activities?
This is where the standard theory gets a little bit squished. You see, if intentional action always needs a prior intention, it gets kind of weird to say we intentionally think a thought. Like you need an intention to have that thought before you actually think it.
That's a mental pretzel.
Yeah, right. And deciding to do something would require a prior intention to make that decision.
It's a loop.
It is a loop. So some philosophers say maybe these mental things aren't actions in the same way that physical movements are.
Okay, so maybe they're different categories.
Right. But the encyclopedia suggests there might be ways to make these mental activities fit into the intentional action framework.
Okay, so there are ways to square the circle, maybe.
Exactly. Philosophers are clever like that. So Melee, for instance, he argues that making a decision can be seen as an action driven by a more general intention. It's not about intending a specific choice, but more about intending to settle a question. So the decision becomes intentional under that broader goal.
It's the intention to resolve the issue.
Exactly. He uses a similar idea for remembering. Maybe the act of remembering isn't always intentional, but trying to remember definitely is.
So it's the effort that counts.
Yeah, the effort makes it intentional. Now, Hieronymy, she takes a slightly different route. She focuses on this idea of evaluative control. This is about the control we have over our beliefs and desires, settling on what we believe or want to do, and she argues this mental agency is different from the control we have over our bodies.
Interesting. So different types of control for different domains. What about some of those other kinds of agency you mentioned earlier, like epistemic agency? That one seems particularly relevant to philosophy itself.
Oh, definitely. Epistemic agency is all about the control we have over our own beliefs. Most folks agree that we have some indirect control. We can choose to look for new information, consider different viewpoints, engage in practices that help us form better beliefs.
So it's about actively shaping our beliefs.
Exactly. But direct control, just deciding to believe something because you want to, that's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, that seems trickier.
Right. It clashes with the idea that beliefs should be based on evidence and reasons, not just our whims.
Our beliefs should be tethered to reality. What about shared and collective agency? Those seem super important in today's world.
Absolutely. This is all about people acting together as a group.
Okay.
The big question is, can group action be totally reduced to the agency of each individual? Or is there a separate kind of agency that exists at the group level?
Like a hive mind, almost.
Kind of, right. And this brings up the thorny issue of whether we can talk about groups having intentions, beliefs, and stuff like that.
Can a group have a mind of its own? Fascinating.
Right. And then we have relational agency, which has been a big focus, especially in feminist philosophy.
Okay, what's the idea there?
This view challenges those classic individualistic ideas about autonomy and agency. It says our relationships with others, the fact that we depend on each other, those aren't just external factors. They're actually part of what makes up our agency.
So our relationships define who we are as agents.
Exactly. Like Westland talks about this dialogical way of being reflective and responsive to others as crucial for becoming autonomous. And finally, we have artificial agency. Can AI be agents?
That's the million-dollar question these days.
It really is. From the standard theory viewpoint, the key question is, can AI systems have real mental states, the kind that would allow them to have intentions and act on them? Instrumentalists like Dennett, they might say it doesn't matter if AI has real inner states as long as we can predict its behavior by talking about beliefs and desires and all that.
Okay, so it's useful fiction.
Yeah, but realists, they would want to see evidence of genuine inner states, not just pretend ones. And even for that minimal agency idea we talked about, Brandarian and others say current AI isn't there yet, especially when it comes to that basic drive for self-preservation.
So they're not truly self-sustaining yet?
Right. Okay, that was a whirlwind tour of the agency landscape. Let's go even deeper now into the metaphysics of agency. What are the big, mind-blowing questions that philosophers are grappling with in this domain? The core questions are all about the very essence of agency. What is it, really? How are agents and actions connected? And how does agency fit into a world where things seem to happen because of cause and effect?
It's like asking, what is the nature of action in a world governed by physical laws?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the encyclopedia outlines 3 main metaphysical frameworks that try to tackle these questions.
Okay, so 3 main contenders.
Yeah. First up, we've got the event-causal framework, which we already touched on with the standard theory. It tries to explain agency by looking at the cause and effect relationships between events involving the agent. Actions are seen as events with the right causal history, usually involving mental states.
Okay, familiar territory.
Right. It's all about tracing the causal chain. And it's generally considered a reductive approach because it analyzes agency in terms of those cause and effect relations. Then we have agent-causal theories. They say, no, agency is a different beast altogether. It's about the agent as a whole causing actions directly.
So it's not just mental states causing movements, it's the agent itself acting.
Exactly. It's a distinct kind of causal power, not reducible to just chains of events. Thinkers like Chisholm, Taylor, and O'Connor, they're big proponents of this view.
So they're saying the agent has a unique causal power.
Right. And finally, we have volitionism. This framework throws acts of will, or volitions, into the mix. These volitions, they're seen as the ultimate source of agency, directly causing those physical movements we call actions.
Okay, so volitions are like the prime movers of action.
Exactly. And they're often described as uncaused, like they just happen, not because of something else. Genet and McCann are key figures here. So you've got these three frameworks, each trying to make sense of agency in its own way.
It sounds like the event causal framework is the most popular kid in school.
Yeah, for sure. One reason is that it seems to fit nicely with the idea that the world operates according to natural laws.
Okay, so it's more scientifically palatable.
Exactly. It avoids introducing mysterious concepts like agent causation or teleology. And there's also a lot of skepticism towards agent causal and volitionist theories. For agent causation, the big question is, what exactly is this substance causation? And can we really distinguish it from complex event causal chains?
So it's about whether it's truly a different kind of causation.
Right. And volitionism gets criticized for just assuming these uncaused acts of will without really explaining how they work or how the agent controls them. And if volitions are brain events, then how can they be uncaused?
Yeah, that seems to clash with our understanding of the brain.
Exactly. Now, remember earlier we talked about deviant causal chains, that big challenge for event causal theories.
Yeah, the weird cause and effect situations.
Right. It shows that even if you have the right mental states causing the right movements, it doesn't automatically mean it's an intentional action if the causal path is messed up.
Like that climber example.
Exactly. The climber who accidentally loosens his grip because of his intention to signal, or the nephew whose intention to inherit leads to an accidental killing.
Oh, yeah. Those cases are tricky.
They are. The challenge for the standard theory is to define what non-deviant causation looks like without sneaking in some unanalyzed agent causation or control.
Right. They need to stay within their framework.
Exactly. And Davidson himself wasn't too optimistic about finding a neat solution.
So he wasn't sure they could solve the puzzle.
Yeah. While some philosophers have proposed solutions, deviant causal chains remain a big hurdle for event causal theories.
A persistent problem. Now, there's another objection we hear a lot, the disappearing agent objection. What's that all about?
It's the worry that by focusing so much on cause and effect, event causal theories kind of lose track of the agent, the one doing the acting.
So the agent becomes invisible in the sea of causes.
Yeah, it's like they reduce actions to just happenings.
And that doesn't feel right intuitively.
No, it doesn't. This objection is one of the reasons why agent causal and volitionist views are appealing. They put the agent back in the spotlight.
Yeah.
Even some event causal theorists, like Velleman, have acknowledged this issue, calling it the shrinking agent problem, where the agent's role seems really passive.
Like they're just along for the ride.
Yeah. Now, the encyclopedia introduces this other approach called dual standpoint theory. How does that handle these metaphysical conundrums? So dual standpoint theorists, they're like, hold up, we can't fully explain agency using any metaphysical framework, whether it's event causal, agent causal, or volitionist.
So they're throwing out all the frameworks.
Yeah, they're saying none of them quite capture it. They argue that we can only really understand agency from our own perspective, as agents making choices, giving reasons, holding ourselves and others accountable. They often go for non-causal explanations of reasons, focusing on those normative, goal-oriented aspects of agency.
So it's about how we experience agency from the inside.
Exactly. It's about the subjective perspective. But critics say they're dodging the tough questions about control and causation in a world where things seem to be governed by cause and effect.
Okay, so they're accused of avoiding the hard problems.
Yeah, something like that. The final part of the metaphysics section talks about the nature of actions themselves, whether they're events, processes, and the whole issue of omissions. Do these debates really change how we understand agency? So there are discussions about how to count actions. For example, as flipping a switch, turning on a light, and alerting a burglar, all one action with different descriptions. Or are they separate actions?
Okay, so how do we carve up actions?
Right. Philosophers debate this, but most agree that these debates, while interesting, don't really change the core metaphysical issues about agency.
So it's a side issue, sort of.
Yeah. The same goes for the question of whether actions are outcomes or processes. It doesn't really impact the big picture.
Yeah.
Now, intentional omissions, deliberately not doing something, those raise some interesting points.
Okay. So not acting is also an action.
Right. Sartorio, for example, she says her account of intentional omission, where the absence of an action is caused by the absence of an intention, challenges the standard causal theories.
So it's like saying the lack of intention is what causes the lack of action.
Exactly. But Clark argues that there's often an intention not to act, and that intention plays a causal role, just like intentions cause positive actions.
So it's a matter of whether there's an intention involved at all.
Right. The bigger point is, does a theory of action need to explain omissions, given that acting and not acting are different?
It's a good question. All this philosophical groundwork is essential, but the encyclopedia emphasizes that we also need to look at empirical challenges and the role of consciousness in understanding agency.
Absolutely. It's about bringing our theories in line with what science tells us. Our everyday intuition is that our conscious reasons and intentions drive our actions. This is also the picture we see in the standard theory and a lot of psychology.
Right, it's the common sense view.
Exactly. But research in psychology and neuroscience has thrown some serious challenges at this, making us question just how much conscious influence we really have.
So science is questioning our intuitive understanding.
Yeah. The encyclopedia mentions Nisbet and Wilson's work on confabulation. What do their findings tell us about conscious agency? They found that people often make up explanations for their choices that aren't the real reasons.
So we're not always aware of why we do things.
Yeah, we can be pretty bad at introspection. But it's important to remember that they didn't say reasons are never causal.
Okay, so it's not a complete denial of reasons.
Right. Their main point was that we're not always good at knowing our own minds.
Makes sense. What about situationism in social psychology?
This view emphasizes the power of situations in shaping our behavior.
Okay, so the context matters.
Yeah. It argues that our actions are often more influenced by the circumstances we're in than by our character traits or intentions. While this might challenge our everyday thinking about agency, it's worth noting that standard theories don't usually rely on strong character traits as the main drivers of action.
So it doesn't necessarily contradict the standard theory.
Right. But it does raise questions about how responsive we are to reasons, because it suggests that seemingly small, irrelevant things can have a big impact on our choices, even bypassing our conscious thinking.
So we're not always as rational as we think we are.
Yeah. Now, we can't talk about challenges to conscious agency without mentioning Libet and Wegner. Let's start with Libet's experiments.
Okay, the famous ones.
Yeah. His experiments seem to show that brain activity related to a movement starts before we're consciously aware of intending to move.
You know, our brains are acting before we decide to act.
That's how he interpreted it. And he saw this as a challenge to free will.
That's a pretty radical interpretation.
It was. And it sparked a lot of debate. What have philosophers said about Libet's findings? Well, some pointed out methodological issues, like the difficulty of measuring the exact timing of both brain activity and conscious experience.
Okay, so maybe the measurements weren't perfect.
Right. More importantly, many argued that his conclusions didn't necessarily follow from his data. There are other ways to interpret the findings. For example, maybe the conscious urge to move comes after the brain has already started preparing, but it's still a crucial part of the process.
So it's not just a passive experience.
Exactly. The artificiality of the experiment has also been criticized. It's not like making decisions in real life.
Yeah, it's a very controlled setting.
Right. And newer research, like by Sugar, suggests that the timing Libet saw might be explained by random brain fluctuations, especially for simple decisions.
So maybe it's not as generalizable as he thought.
Right. Now, Wegner came up with the apparent mental causation model. What did he argue? He said we often feel like our intentions cause our actions, but it might be an illusion.
So we think we're in control, but we're not, really.
That's his idea. He proposed that we get a sense of agency when three things happen. We think about the action before it happens, our thought matches the action, and there are no other obvious causes. But he presented evidence from studies showing that our sense of agency can be messed up. Sometimes we feel in control when we're not, and vice versa.
So our feelings can be misleading.
Yeah. However, Wegner's model has been criticized for being unclear about key concepts and for misinterpreting some of the evidence. Just because our sense of agency can be wrong sometimes doesn't mean it's always wrong.
So maybe there's a grain of truth in our experience.
Exactly. Now let's talk about automaticity and dual system theory.
Okay.
Research on automaticity shows that we do a lot of things without conscious awareness or control. Think about priming, where exposure to a concept unconsciously influences your behavior.
Like those subliminal messages.
Yeah, kind of. But it's important to note that many automatic actions are part of bigger conscious goals. It's like driving a car, lots of automatic processes, but you're still consciously choosing where to go.
So they're like tools that our conscious mind can use.
Exactly. How does dual system theory fit into this? This theory says we have two systems for making decisions. System one is fast, intuitive, often emotional.
Okay, like our gut feeling.
Yeah. And system two is slower, deliberate, analytical. This seems to challenge the traditional idea of a single, unified, rational mind.
So it's like two minds in one head.
Kind of. And there's debate about how they interact. Some philosophers think they can be seen as parts of a single mechanism.
So maybe it's not as separate as it seems.
Right. Lastly, the encyclopedia looks at the sense of agency itself. What have we learned about how we experience ourselves as agents?
So the study of the sense of agency has become more empirical, moving beyond just philosophical thinking. Wegner focused on cognitive interpretation, but the feedback comparator model, which comes from neuroscience, has gained.